we'll give people just one more minute to come on board. While I'm waiting, I'll explain the format of today's meeting. Initially, we'll share some slides in relation to a survey project that we've done. Those slides will be co-presented by myself, Ugurtan Akyurek, our geospatial scientist, and Andrew Cleland, our survey technician. Following the slide deck, we'll open up the chat channel for Q&A and provide people an opportunity to gather additional information, have any questions that have popped up as a consequence of our survey responded to, and also to give people an opportunity to, seek broader information if they've come to this webinar with pre-existing questions. All right, so we are at 12:05, and we do have a bit of stuff to get through. So whilst we've only got 18 people on board, I think we will get cracking with the webinar and other people can settle in as they join us. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today. As I indicated, my name's Alistair. Co-presenting with me will be Andrew and Ugurtan, and our focus in today's webinar will be reviewing a survey project that we did earlier this year up in far north Queensland during one of the more intense wet seasons we've had in the last 600 years. And we will review the range of survey methodologies that we undertook in this relatively short period of time. So a bit of background to this. Who is Dianne, this richest lady in the north? Perhaps we can start with addressing that question. So Dianne is actually the name of a mine. It's not a mysterious lady in a limousine in New York. And Dianne mine was named by Mareeba local Bob Keddy, a geologist, after his wife, who is an Indigenous lady local to the area, led him to an area of green rocks back in 1970. Dianne is up here in far north Queensland. It's located near the historic Palmer River goldfields, approximately 160 kilometres northwest of Cairns. And perhaps a little more humorously, it's a mere 36 kilometres northeast of the curiously named Groganville. And for any fans of Triple J, they once had a funniest place names competition, and I rang up and informed them of Groganville and Cape York, and they refused to believe me. So I'm just here today to prove that point. Moving right along, Dianne was active between 1970 and 1983, and during its operational life, it produced over 63,000 tonnes of copper ore with an average copper grade of 22%, the highest grade copper in Australia's history. And that's why we talk about the richest lady in the north. In fact, some of the samples collected during initial exploration assayed as high as 68% copper, and there's still some very high concentrated rock sitting on the surface based on my recent visit. The site is currently maintained and the mining lease is owned by Revolver Resources. Revolver Resources is a small cap miner listed on the ASX, which is currently completing studies to support copper production in the near term. And when we say Dianne took everything, I mean she really took everything. She took 17 Emlid RTK receivers, 10 tripods, and so much more on our initial survey visit. And the origin to this was the customer rang us up and said, look, we really need a three-dimensional model of the site as soon as possible. Can you get us something by the end of next month? So that basically gave us 5 weeks to go out to a site that had no pre-existing survey control that was still in place. To establish that site survey control, they wanted a detailed survey of the 13.5 kilometre road edge that led into the site. They wanted an aerial survey. Well, by necessity, we needed to complete an aerial survey using LiDAR and photogrammetry, a bathymetry survey of 3 of the dams on the site. And then we needed to be able to bring all of that together to deliver a three-dimensional model for our customer. And the reason that we're even having this conversation today was after we'd done the project and delivered it to the customer on time, in quality and in full, I was reflecting on the fact that it's a really interesting story because it's a story where Emlid plays a central role in every element of this project. And so we thought that was something worth sharing. So thank you for joining us today. So the first element of this is to establish the site survey control. And to expand on this, I'm going to hand over now to Andrew Cleland, our survey technician, and he's going to talk you through the static survey component of the project. Thanks, Andrew.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'll talk about the static survey control. So why do we do static? Because we want to get really high quality coordinates on marks that we place on site. So we want low positional uncertainty with respect to our datum, which in this case was GDA 2020 and AHD. So the idea is with static that if you log GNSS signals on multiple receivers at the same time for a long period of time, you can get really high accuracy coordinates. So that's what we wanted to do because we wanted to lay a really solid foundation for all the work that was going to come after this. And this work will endure for the duration of the mine, hopefully. So we went there in the wet season and we had to go out and find some marks to propagate datum from. And because we had such a huge wet season, the grass was really long. So we used GPS Motion X, which is an iPhone app, to just stake out latitude and longitude. And it was quicker than pulling out a rover. We could just use the phone. So that was really nice. Okay, so our site is down there in the bottom left-hand corner. And we had a couple of PSMs out on the highway that we wanted to tie into to propagate datum. And we also had the Laura Cores base, which was about 60 k's to the north. So we were going to be going out on the highway and then driving into the site. And it was quite difficult access. So we weren't going to be able to go back to the highway to do anything if we needed to, which presented a little bit of a challenge. So LDWPSB, which stands for Long Duration Waterproof Sandwich Bag. So we needed these receivers out on the highway to be logging the entire time that we were on site, because we're going to set up receivers on site and you need to be collecting these signals at the same time. So if the battery went flat, it was going to be an issue. So the Emlid receivers have a 22-hour internal battery if you're logging static, but we needed more than that. So we just plugged in a portable USB-C battery pack to give us a bit of extra charge. And we put it upside down in a sandwich bag and just duct taped it to the pole and plugged it in with a USB-C cable. I was a bit worried about this because temps were over 35 degrees while we were out there. It was really hot and a storm rolled through in one of the afternoons. So I was pretty relieved when we came back to see 2 of the charge lights, 2 out of 5, still on the receiver. So the external battery had gone flat, but the receiver still had some kick in it. So we were logging in total for about 34 hours on those marks. So I was very chuffed. So this is our site. We installed 3 marks and we wanted multiple marks for redundancy. Marks get knocked all the time. And when you set up, you want to be able to check that you've got good coordinates and everything's all sweet. So how are we actually going to do the static survey? Well, we need to have multiple receivers logging on multiple marks. And we need to do that multiple times. We did 3 sessions because with 2 sessions, you're able to see if there is a difference. But with 3, you're able to see where the difference might lie. So we had the receivers out on the highway logging for the entire time. And then we had receivers on the marks that we installed on site. And we actually rotated those each session. How long were the sessions? So the Laura Cores was about 60 k's away. And based on guidelines from ICSM, they recommend 1 hour plus 5 minutes per kilometer for classic static. So we did 6 hours for each session. So we went to site, we installed all the benchmarks, and then once we had all of them running, all of them logging, that's when we pressed start on the clock. So we had 6 hours to wait. Then we would drive back to those same 3 marks, put a new receiver on there. And the reason why you do that, and one of the reasons why you do sessions, is to try and find errors as well. When you're taping the antenna height, you might just read it wrong. So if you just repeat you've got a better shot of getting a really good outcome. But it's a lot of work. So yeah, that's what we did. We installed 3 really long 1.8 meter long star pickets with a star picket driver. We'd set up the marks on the highway. We measured all of the heights of the antennas. We filled out booking forms and took a lot of photos. So at the end, you end up with 19 booking forms, 19 sets of photos, and 19 Rhinex files, which is the data that comes off the receiver. It's really important to have physical documentation when you're doing something like this, booking forms and photos, because if you do make a mistake, you need to be able to find it. So if you were to not do those 2 things and just have the Rhinex files, you'd get back to the office and then you might see that the height's blank in the antenna field. So what are you going to do? You have no idea what height was. So you can't really do much about it. But if you fill out booking forms and take a lot of photos, you can prove what you did and you've got some traceability. So the process for doing QAing everything is quite intense. That's where most of the work goes after the fact. So each receiver could have up to 3 session logs stored. So you need to carefully download the sessions off each receiver, match it up to the correct booking form, and match it up to the correct photos. So you need some really good folder structures to make it easier. You can see there the antenna height was 2 meters. Thanks to Alistair, we were able to measure that, but I wasn't able to. So then you go through the photos and you go, okay, that was a height of 2 meters, check the corresponding booking form, and then you check the Rhinex file to make sure everything's aligned. And once you're happy with your clean data, you can get to fun bit. So in the simplest case with static, you've got 2 receivers logging at the same time. So when you're doing that, they're collecting the same GNSS signals from some of the same satellites. So with that information, you can have some fancy maths calculate a 3D vector between those 2 marks. So then if you've got 2 receivers logging at the same time in the simplest case, in this case, we had about 35 instances of that. So 35 baselines between all these different marks. And you've got, that was across all 3 sessions. So you need to look at each session individually to try and isolate any problems you might have had. So you'll look at session 1, session 2, session 3, then session 1 and session 2, session 2 and session 3, and then eventually all together. But these baselines have errors associated with them because there's error in everything. We're never going to get perfect coordinates. And that might be the antenna height error. Like when you pull a tape measure, you might have 3 to 5 mil of error. The centering error, when you look through the eyepiece of the tribrac and you try and get it over the center of the mark. And then all the other errors we have associated with GNSS, like clock error, ionospheric modeling, tropospherics. And those errors play a really important part in getting a really high accuracy coordinate. So that brings me to the next bit, least squares adjustment. So we can take all of those errors and we can use them to figure out the most probable coordinates for each mark. So we can take all those errors and plug them into a weighted adjustment and give higher quality observations more weight. We do that for each session in isolation again, and then start bringing it all together until we have a final solution that we're really happy with. Along that process, you start fixing the datum marks to tie into datum. And then in the end, we had about 15 mil horizontal and 30 mil vertical positional uncertainty with respect to datum for the marks that we placed on site. So we were really happy, and it laid a great foundation for the rest of the project. Cool.
That's really great. Thanks very much for sharing that information, Andrew, and going into the detail and explaining that for people. It is quite a technical component of the survey, and we wanted to share that sort of level of technical complexity with you so that if any of you are contemplating this, that you understand some of those processes that are required to go through. It's fair to say that that is the most complex, technically complex component of the survey. So hopefully the rest of it will, at an intellectual level anyway, be a bit of an easier ride. So we're going to move on now to the detail survey, which is picking up the road edges of the site. As I indicated, there was 13.5 kilometres of road edges that we needed to collect. Now, because we only had 5 weeks to initiate, plan, execute the entire survey and deliver the three-dimensional model to the customer, we needed to pick up those road edges before we'd established survey control on the site. So we didn't have any existing known marks to work from, but we could work out from the existing marks using a post-process kinematic survey methodology and post-process the coordinates for those road edges. It was difficult terrain. It was hard to propagate radio corrections from the base stations that were logging over those marks out to where we were doing observations. We'll come back to that in a second. And we intended to post-process the survey, as I said. And to support that, we activated logging for the rover. And that allows us to compare the logs on the rover and the logs on the base. And once the positions were known for the base from the previous stuff that Andrew had just discussed, we would be able to go through that PPK process to derive the coordinates for the rover location at each point that we were collecting along the road. So 13.5 kilometres of road edge, and we needed to collect a point at a minimum of every 50 metres along the road. So no less than every 50 metres along the road. At the same time that we were doing that PPK survey and collecting the logs on the rover, we wanted to make sure that we would have a fixed solution between the base and the rover when we went to PPK it, because some of the points that we were collecting were under vegetation. And for anyone that's got experience with RTK GNSS, you will understand that vegetation can sometimes complicate things. So we wanted to make sure that we would be okay. And to mitigate against that risk, we used the internal low-RAR radios of the Emlid equipment to propagate real-time corrections from one of our existing base stations logging raw data out to the rover that was collecting the road edge information. So as I said, it was sort of complex terrain. It was pretty hilly, starting at the northern end of the site where the mine was and moving further south. This is all at the same scale. You can see that there's a bit of terrain in there. That's a oblique view of it. What we had to do was radiate out from our known control, or control that would be known once the initial least squares adjustment work had been completed by Andrew. And so we used a radio to broadcast corrections from the base to the rover, but because of the terrain, the radios weren't powerful enough to push all of that distance and over and around all of those hills and that vegetation. So that meant that we also, as we radiated out, we traversed and established new control, new base stations along the way as we reached the edge of our base radio range. So it's 35 degrees Celsius and it's 90% humidity. Who are you going to call to do a job like this? Like, you're going to drive down the road and jump out every 50 metres and grab a point, and that's like, 980 points times 2, whatever it was, I can't remember. But the point is, it's pretty complex and it's a pretty difficult environment. You're going to call these guys? Hell no, you call Mangoesmapping. So we went out there, we established the base stations, and it just so happened that Andrew was training for an ultra marathon. And when I said to him, what's the most cost-effective way that we can acquire this information for the customer? In Andrew's classic way, he goes, easy, mate, I'll just run it. And if you don't believe me, I've got a little video that should show shortly, showing Andrew in his ultra marathon gear out there running. Now, keep in mind that it's super hot and super humid. So we actually kicked off at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and it worked well. Keep in mind that we had to stop in the middle of all of this and go and rotate bases for the static campaign, and then come back out and continue this survey work. So we ended up doing this work until about 1 in the afternoon. So as I said, we turned on the rover logging, but used that low-RAR radio to propagate real-time corrections to our rover so that every time we collected a point, we would have a fix. And that meant radiating our way out from our known control and setting up base stations like the one you can see in this picture, where we connected back to the existing base to get a fix. And we also then logged static on these receivers and coordinated them with that least squares adjustment methodology as well. And what you can see to the left of the receiver is a painter's pole taped to a tripod, and up on top of that is an extended range antenna. So one of the products that we developed for use in the wilderness areas that we operate is an extended range LoRa antenna. So if any of you are using LoRa for your RTK GNSS with Emlid, and you find that the existing medium gain 3 decibel antenna that ships with the product doesn't quite give you the range you need, and we do have a relatively low cost solution available on the mapgear.com.au website. So that's the extended range antenna kit. Rightio. So when we look at the PPK log of the rover, this is what you can see. We, jog down the road, counting the steps in our mind, and when we get to 50, we stop and grab a point, go across the road, grab a point, run another 50 steps down that side of the road, stop, grab a point, cross the road, grab a point. You get the idea. And so that's what that log looked like from the rover. And from that log and the time-stamped points that we collected on each side of the road, we could do our PPK survey and get accurate coordinates for each side of the road. We also chose to mount a GNSS receiver to the vehicle. And you can see that we've strapped another trusty USB battery bank. And these are just like the USB battery banks you use to charge your phone. We just went down to Big W and cleaned them out the night before the survey. And we used those to feed power into the receivers as we went. And you can see that we've got an extended range antenna attached to that rover as well. And the idea was that by mounting GNSS to the vehicle and driving the road centerline and measuring the height of the antenna above the road and trying not to compress the springs on the vehicle too much, we would be able to PPK that vehicle log, decimate it down to a less dense data set, and compare the elevation values against the adjacent foot-based survey. And that acted as a gross error check to allow us to ensure that the road detail survey information that we'd collected was reliable and fit for purpose. What I'd like to do now is go to the aerial survey component, which included LiDAR data acquisition and aerial photogrammetry. And for that, I'd like to introduce Ugurtan Akyurek, who's our geospatial technician and one of our pilots in Mangoesmapping, who conducted that survey. So Ugurtan, over to you.
Okay. Hey, everyone. So we completed the aerial survey part of this project with Fernando, who is our chief pilot. And we've been asked to generate a 3D digital model of the disturbance area of the mine site. You can see that on the top corner of the imagery. And also the orthomosaic for that area, as well as an orthomosaic for the water supply dam to be used for the mission planning of the bathymetric part of this project. The area size is about 98 hectares, and the survey uncertainty we've been asked for is plus and minus 100 millimeters for both horizontal and vertical against the control areas of clear and open land. So we've been also asked half a meter of interval contours in addition to the DTM for this area. So when we're asked for an aerial survey, the first thing we do is to actually assess the area and see if it's suitable for flights, and also the terrain allows us to do all the survey parts that we want to do. We were fortunate that Alistair and Andrew was on the site before, and they established benchmarks for us so that we could use them for our PPK and RTK. And we also knew about the terrain because we could ask Al and Andrew. If this wasn't the case, we use Google Earth because it can give us an idea about the terrain so that we can actually plan our flights. For this one, we came up with 5 different flight polygons. And when we plan these flight polygons, we want to land the drone before the batteries go flat. And also we want to keep a visual line of sight, which is the CASA requirement when you're flying drones. So we also use Fly Freely. It's a software package that we are using for the as a drone management platform. It just streamlines the process of creating and tracking the missions and also performing airspace and NOTAM checks. It also has a feature that you can manage your RPA and other equipment like your sensors. As a field equipment, we had DJI Matrix 300 RTK drone with Zenmuse L1 LiDAR sensor. Also Emlid receivers, RS2 Plus as a base and RS3 for rover, so that we could survey our ground control points. Triangle extended range antenna kit, as Alistair mentioned. We wanted to have a good range with our antenna, the radio, so we could actually perform the GCP survey. And also core fluid ground control point targets, so that we can actually be fast while we're doing it. First thing we do after the site induction is set up the base stations for PPK, so that we can process the drone data after the survey. Also, they are used. One of these receivers are used for as an RTK base for on an RS3 receiver for ground control point survey. They both recorded RINEX static data, just in case one of the receivers can have a bad data from the areas that of the terrain, like there are a lot of trees around. So another one serves as a redundancy. We came up with 18 ground control points in the area, and they are used as checkpoints, as well as aligning the model to get a better accuracy. As you can see, there are no ground control points on the southeast of the area, because the terrain was really rough and there were no tracks that we can actually walk or drive there. When we could, we used the core fluid targets, but some of the terrain wasn't really good, so that we could drill the targets on the ground. So we just sprayed. We were able to finish all the flights and all of the land survey in one day, but it's a lot of work to do all of those 18 points and fly 5 different flights. So last 2 flights were during the afternoon, and there was a lot of shadows, and we don't want the shadows to appear on our orthomosaic. Just affects the quality of the image. So we just decided to stay one more night and repeat those last 2 flights on the next day. And the next day was just beautiful overcast weather, which is ideal for capturing imagery. Once all of the flights were finished, we quality check the flights, the imagery, and the data we captured, and we head back to the office for processing the data. So when processing the data, we are using DJI Terra for the LiDAR data post-processing, Redcatch Red Toolbox for the RGB data post-processing. Both of these software are available on our website, metgear.com.au. As a photogrammetry software, we use Agisoft Metashape, and TerraScan UAV is really powerful for point cloud classification. Global Mapper is our tool to generate DTM and contour lines. So first step is post-processing the RGB data, so I can actually have orthomosaics to create polygons on the land. So Redcatch Red Toolbox is really useful for that. Once all of those images are georeferenced, they're fed into the Metashape software, and Metashape gives us the orthomosaic of the site. After the RGB, the second step of the project was post-processing the LiDAR data. So DJI Terra needs to be used for the Zenmuse LiDAR sensors, and it also georeferences the data using the static logs from the Emlids and the static logs from the M300 drone. Once the data is georeferenced, we use TerraSolid UAV to cleaning the noise of the point cloud and also classifying the points. So on the right side, you can see that the The red dots are just the terrain, whereas the green ones are all terrain that the Zen Musel one has captured. In Terrasolid UAV, we also use the ground control points we captured during the survey for aligning the data as well as checking the quality of the model. And as you can see, the root mean square, we were like X and Y, average of the X and Y is about 13 millimeters horizontal and 21 millimeters vertical accuracy, which we were really happy with. Once all the point cloud data was classified, cleaned, so that now they can be used for generating DTM. Global Mapper is great for that. So this is the DTM we generated. You can see that there are a lot of holes. These are the water reservoirs in the mine site, and that's why we had better survey to fill those holes. Over to you.
All right, and welcome back. So the next stage, of course, was to complete the bathymetric survey over 3 of those 4 water bodies. If I just bounce back one slide, you can see the 3 southern water bodies were the ones that were surveyed. The 4th water body to the north was in the actual mine pit itself, and that was deemed unnecessary to survey. They didn't require 3-dimensional data in that area, so that was excluded from the scope of the project. So the first part was to plan the mission. And a bathymetry survey is a little bit like a drone survey. So you can imagine that, you go into DJI Go and you lay out the area to be surveyed, and then you generate survey lines, with waypoints effectively, a bit like flight lines for the boat to autonomously navigate. And of course, in this environment, we want to dodge all of that aquatic weed, because there's nothing worse than aquatic weed choking up the propeller on your boat and getting you into the situation where you've got to go and recover your vessel from the middle of the water. So the benefit that we had was that Ugurtan and Fernando had already gone out and done the LiDAR and aerial photogrammetry. So rather than relying on Google Earth or Queensland Globe imagery to inform our understanding of the location of that aquatic weed, we used the orthophoto from their project to know where the weeds were to avoid them in the mission plan. But of course, they say that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy, and the enemy for us in this entire project was the weather. In the day, so the photo that you can see here is the highway. That's the access road, the main highway that goes up the coast, the highway where we had our base station set up for the static survey. And we needed to cross this river and then drive another, 80 kilometers along the highway before we could head out through a whole series of other creeks and ford those creeks to be able to access the site. So unfortunately, the major storms were still battering the coast, and the site received 150 millimeters in one afternoon between when the orthophoto was acquired and when we went out to do the bathy survey. The consequence of all of that water was that it increased the dam level, and with the associated winds that came with that storm, it shifted the aquatic weed up to 10 meters out of its known position that had been mapped using the ortho photos just days earlier. Anyway, what do? We go out there, and just like the road details survey, we used RTK to be able to validate that we would be able to have a fixed solution for the rover. So I said rover, remotely operated vessel, bit of a play on words there. In any case, so to do that, we needed to establish our RTK base station. The final processing, however, again, used a PPK process with the raw Rhinex data from both the base and the rover for the lowest possible positional uncertainty. So here's an image of the vessel that we used, the remotely operated vessel. So it's a bathy survey vessel, and that contains an Emlid receiver inside the hull of the vessel. And in approximately the midsection of the vessel, if you can see my cursor, there's an Emlid low-RA antenna so that it could receive that correction via low-RA radio from the base. So there's a lot of systems that operate a bathymetry boat. So you've got the remotely operated vessel navigation control, the bathy sensor control, the remote visualization of the location of the boat. We've got 2 FPV cameras and Additionally, logging the data and looking at the RTK telemetry as well. So to operate all of that, we had 2 computers and 3 screens feeding data, you know, that were visualizing the data that was coming back from the boat. So lots of systems to get working and to keep working during that survey. So there's a photo of the boat in action out there in the dam. We don't have to dodge trees when we fly drones. So one of the biggest challenges we had here was we can use the aerial survey to plan our flight paths for the remotely operated vessel. But then, of course, you know, this dam was full of trees that had just died when the dam had been, you know, flooded that valley. So when we're operating at aerial survey altitudes, we don't have that challenge. So we had a pre-existing survey line, and then using the sensors on the boat. So in this image, you can see in here, we've got a GoPro camera, plus we've got another FPV camera above that. They're both feeding back red, green, blue, like standard image video data to us, so that we can observe the operating environment immediately in front of the boat and take evasive action as required. And up the front here, there's also a sonar sensor that is used for obstacle avoidance. And that'll automate obstacle avoidance, but it's not perfect. So that's where the cameras come in to help us avoid those obstacles, such as trees and aquatic vegetation. And, you know, using that, we were pretty much able to minimize the collisions. But there was the odd expletive emitted during the survey as we did prang into a couple of trees and did hit a bit of aquatic weed. Thankfully, we didn't have to get the kayak off the roof of the 4-wheel drive to do any recovery of the vessel. You can see in this photo that the entire perimeter of the lake was surrounded with aquatic vegetation. So even launching and recovering the boat was the vessel was a challenge. And so we just, you know, got a big old stick and dragged that through the aquatic weed a number of times to pull enough of it out of the way to sort of create a weed-free access channel here. And that allowed us to do our launch and recovery without needing to get into the water. There's a couple of photos of the operation of the vessel. This is down in the release dam. So this is, the water here is not as clean. On the right-hand photo, you can see our sit-on-top kayak on top of the 4-wheel drive. That's our recovery vessel of last resort. And you can see in the left-hand photo, we've got our handheld controller for the vessel, including some of the telemetry data. And on the right-hand photo, we've got our laptop with 2 additional screens providing additional radio telemetry data. And while Ray was operating the vessel and conducting the Bathy boat, I grabbed a normal survey rover and I walked around the water body surveying shoreline so that we would know the level of the water and extrapolate between that and the subsurface readings, because there is a fundamental limit to how shallow the remotely operated vessel can conduct bathymetry. So effectively, you know, we would operate it up into sort of waters at 30 centimeters depth. And after the survey, we knock out any measurements that are above 50 centimeters below the water level and interpolate between those and the surface readings, the shoreline surface readings, and the LiDAR topography readings from above the surface. I also used the rover to go downstream below the embankments that impounded the water, and I picked up the shape of the valley and the valley floor below the impoundment. And that allowed us to, again, act as a bit of a gross error check to validate the model depth of inundation immediately upstream from the embankment. So we could see that they tied in fairly nicely. So the deliverables from the Bathy survey are visualized here with that thematic range of depth from red to blue. And, you know, we had that 3-dimensional model of the floor of the 3 dams that were surveyed. As I indicated, any depths less than 50 centimeters were interpolated back to the shoreline terrestrial survey. And then we just needed to be able to bring that 3-dimensional model from the Bathy survey together with the 3-dimensional model from the aerial survey. So that was a pretty straightforward process in Global Mapper. We had our 3-dimensional model of the underground surface from the point cloud and combined the 2 models into one. So that was the combined digital terrain model, which was one of the survey deliverables that the client requested. The second survey deliverable was the 50 centimetre interval or 0.5 metre interval contour lines. And in summary, that project was delivered in a total of 3 field trips and a total of 5 weeks from project approval to project delivery, but it was a big effort. Excuse me for 1 second. Sorry, I've just returned from a trip to Germany last week, and I think I got Fergie on the way home. Rightio. So to conclude, I just want to take a moment to introduce our sales team, Brad and Jamie Lees. And Brad and Jamie Lees will send out a link to the recording of this webinar, so that if any of you would like to review the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to. And I guess at this point, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions. So if anyone's got any questions, we'd encourage you to type them into the chat window, and we'll do our best to provide you with additional information on that. Brendan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I was just going to mention how we use the Emlid at Wannon Water. We just have a couple of units that we provide our meter readers, so that they're external contractors. They go around and read our customers' property meter reads, and also have a list of non-spatialized meters, so new developments or subdivisions or just replaced meters. We'll give them a list. They just use the Flow Emlid Flow app, so we don't need to get into all the detail of data dictionaries and that sort of thing. The only field they need to capture is the property ID, which we provide them. So yeah, quite simple. Using the SBAS system with a SIM card. That's a level of accuracy we need. So nothing nearly as complex as the maths and equations as you showed today. But yeah, they just capture that by townships, and each month give us the downloaded zip file, and we publish that into our customer billing system to update XY coordinates. So a bit of a simple method, but it works. It's not a high accuracy sort of data capture exercise, and we want something that is easy to use for contractors, so we're not continuously having to upskill people.
So yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned that ease of use, Brendan, because when we've gone back to our customers and done a bit of, market research on what is it about Emlid that they find so special, we always thought it was the price point, because Emlid is exceptionally affordable by contrast to, the incumbents in the GNSS industry. However, there are other cheap receivers, and there are other receivers that offer comparable precision, but the one standout value proposition for Emlid was the simplicity, its ease of use. So it's really interesting that you relate to that.
Yeah, we've got other devices for internal use with data dictionary and Esri products and that sort of thing, but not needing it for this particular business use. We're like, well, let's get a couple of Emlids. They are held with the contractor. Like, we don't need them to return them regularly or anything like that. But they do if there's firmware upgrades and that sort of thing. We'll monitor that, or if they charges sort of get wear and tear. But apart from that, we've been using that process for maybe 4 years now. Just before, or just before COVID, I think we purchased our first models.
Yeah, right. And look, we just completed a water meter mapping project for another local government up north, on Cape York as well, actually. And they said, look, just knowing where their water meters were, about half the amount of time that they needed to complete their water meter read. Do you find that there are occasions where your water meter readers can actually use the pre-existing location and stake it out with the Emlid, or that's never really required?
No, that's never really required. So if the meter gets relocated or removed, the coordinates will get removed from that billing system, and that's how our customer service team indicates it's a new meter, it's been moved, and once those coordinates disappear, it's removed from our GIS, just because it reads directly from that, and it goes back onto the meter reader's report to go and resurvey that particular property when they're in the area next. So yeah, they don't have a list of current meters. They're not doing any verifications like that, just because we don't expect them to move
Yeah.
without that workflow of being actually disposed and replaced.
Yeah, interesting. And it's a commendably tight asset data management lifecycle that you're illustrating there in terms of maintaining that link between the asset change and what's visualized by the stakeholders and the users of that asset data. Just for the benefit of other audience members, one of the things that Brendan referred to, the reference to SBAS, but Brendan, I reckon you probably meant AusCores, which is the free Australian government internet-based correction network that allows people to take a rover.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I was looking and trying to understand all the different ones, and I can't remember what we landed on at the end, but yeah.
Yeah, that's all right. I just wanted to clarify that for anyone else that might have got the wrong idea. Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Has anyone else got anything they'd like to discuss? No? Well, I might take this opportunity then to thank everyone that remains for participating today. I hope you've learned something. Please feel free to reach out to Brad and Jamie Lees if you have any questions, and whatever they can't answer, they'll escalate through to our technical team, our application engineers here at Mangoesmapping, to ensure that we can deliver any certainty that you require. And as indicated, we will circulate a recording of this, and it will once it's all finalized, it will also be available on the Mangoesmapping YouTube channel. So thanks very much everyone for participating, and we'll see you at the next webinar.